Hi there, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy, and I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topic for tonight is Empowering Democracy Lessons from Brazil. It may be premature to draw too many lessons, but I'm going to talk about that anyway. I think it's important to put Brazil in a realistic perspective at this time and to get some expectations that may be more reasonable than some of the previous expectations that I spoke about. So let me do that by going through some posts. I'm going to go through one which actually precedes the election and preceded the verdict. That has preceded the who won. This is a piece from Counterpunch. It appeared on October 25th. What's at stake in Brazil's elections? By Wagner Iglesias. There's a picture of Lula looking really contemplative. And let's see if I can't get this a little more plain here. What's at stake in Brazil's elections by Wagner Iglesias? The results of the first round of the general elections in Brazil surprised everyone. Given the number in the polls on voters' intentions carried out by various institutes in the weeks prior to Election Day, in the October 2nd vote, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva almost made the 50% cut to win without a runoff, garnering 48.4% of the valid votes. Altogether, there were 57 million votes. But the surprise was that current President Jair Bolsonaro obtained 43.2% of valid votes, 51 million votes, a figure that far exceeded the projections in the polls up until the eve of the elections and demonstrated a degree of resilience and social penetration of the Brazilian extreme right that the progressive camp did not imagine existed. Various analysts in Brazil and other parts of the world spent the days after the elections discussing hypotheses about the Bolsonaro electoral success, which was also responsible for the advance of the right and the extreme right in the National Congress, winning more than 24 of seats in the Chamber of Deputies. Several Bolsonaro allies in the Senate elections also won their races, including his former ministers or supporters from the armed forces, police, and the evangelical churches. The right's victories go to show that Bolsonaro was not an outlier, or his election in 2018 was not an isolated event. He proved in this 2000. He proved in the 2022 election. His broad political and social support demonstrates strategy, calculation, and an insightful reading of recent changes in the Brazilian society. There are several explanations for this phenomenon of the Brazilian election of 2022. The extreme right is on a roll in various parts of the world. Bolsonaro stands among other leaders such as Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, and Rodrigo Duterte, to mention a few of the most prominent. All of them, each in his own way, are the result of the deep crisis of representative liberal democracy. There are also regional aspects that help to understand the rise and strengthening of the extreme right in Latin America. The results for Bolsonaro are the result of years of judicial activism in the fight against, quote, corruption, unquote, directed, at least in the case of Latin America, almost exclusively at left-wing political leaders, including Lula, by Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and Cristina Kirchner in Argentina, and more recently Pedro Castillo in Peru. The Lava Jato operation, that was the car wash operation, so called, in Brazil, ruined the reputation of traditional politicians in Brazil and, in a certain way, criminalized political activity itself, opening space for the emergence of a politician of little experience who presented himself before the electorate in 2018 as an outsider and triumphed at the polls. Now, 4 years later, he has once again shown electoral strength. There are also national variables specific to the social and political situation in Brazil. Bolsonaro is a candidate for re-election, which traditionally gives him an advantage over the other candidates for office. That has happened in the past with Fernando Henrique Cardoso, Dilma Rousseff, and Lula himself. In recent months, the government has allocated large amounts of public resources for social programs to help the poorest. Add to this the creation of the unprecedented, quote, secret budget, unquote. These funds bought the electoral loyalty of the majority of current deputies and senators, who went on to receive enormous amounts of public funds from the federal government to apply them to their respective bases in elections, without any transparency or control by the responsible bodies, the press, or civil society. The widespread use of social networks in the election also played a huge role, especially WhatsApp, TikTok, and Facebook. The opposition to the government cites the use of these networks by government and its supports for the massive dissemination of false news about opposition party and candidates, mainly on the left. Finally, the adherence of evangelical churches to Bolsonaro's candidacy created a powerful network of support and dissemination of his ideas throughout Brazil, from the suburbs of the large metropolises such as Rio and Sao Paulo to the smallest towns, especially in the interior of the country, in the most remote corners where churches operate. Analysts also speculate that the high rate of abstention in the first round, more than 20% of voters did not go to the polls, helped Bolsonaro and hurt Lula, whose majority of voters are low income and face financial restrictions to travel from their homes to the polling places. In addition to these factors that help to understand the strong showing of Bolsonaro on October 2nd, which guaranteed him a majority in the National Congress if he were reelected for a new 4-year term, and which took the presidential election to the second round, there are deeper issues that precede his rise that will continue to be central to understanding contemporary Brazil, regardless of who triumphs in the runoff. Although the neoliberal economic agenda implemented in Brazil in the early 1990s has not achieved good economic results in all those years, it undoubtedly triumphed ideologically and culturally in Brazilian society. Ideas such as individual effort, free enterprise, meritocracy, personal success, etc., reached all social classes and regions of the country in recent decades, even during the 13 years of the Workers' Party government, Lula and Dilma, between 2003 and 2016. The idea that politics is essentially a corrupt and inefficient activity, and that individuals can only count on themselves, their families, and gods to prosper in life, has spread amazingly in recent years in the country. Okay, and Bolsonaro took advantage of this phenomenon to transfer the electoral debate from economic and social questions to themes of customs and values, deepening the moralization of the Brazilian public debate. If he is reelected, he will have with him a national Congress, mostly elected by virtue of these ideas, and a very expressive portion of society totally convinced that the free market and religious faith are the fundamental pillars of public life. If, on the other hand, Lula wins on October 30th, it will be up to his government and progressives in general to disarm this cultural, ideological bomb and try to return the public debate to issues closer to politics, such as the strengthening of institutions, the management of the economy, and the expansion of public policies with the objective of reducing poverty and inequality. So, that's a piece that I think provides insight into Brazil as a developing economy and society. Wagner Iglesias is a doctor in sociology and a professor at the School of Art Sciences and Humanities at the University of Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo, okay, Brazil. So let me stop sharing that. And move to a column. Let me do a little bit of sharing for a second. Okay. Now let me check out some comments first. Steve Wolfrand says Bolsonaro is terrible for the Amazon. Folks, he is. Steve Wolfrand said, I was in Cuba, studied at the university. People there have lots of time for art and music. The culture is extremely strong. Their medical sector is extremely strong too. And I believe their life expectancy in Cuba has reached the life expectancy of the United States, perhaps even a little longer right now. And Venezuela also has a music program, free instruments and lessons for poor people. They have a fantastic orchestra. Thank you, Steve. That is a good thing to know. I did not know it. Steve said, I was in Venezuela. The government would drop off pallets of cinder block and concrete for poor people, uh, to build a house with. He says, we need a Lula here. I think we had a Lula here. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Steve says, I've been to Brazil twice. Lula was very beloved there, at least by the people I hung out with. And Kay says, hi, Joe and Steve, and hello, Doc. I thought there were a lot of comments here. Thank you very much for all the comments. Let me share the second piece here. This piece is by an old friend who has been somewhat silent of late. I am hoping that he will make a comeback. This one is from Common Dreams. Lula's victory in Brazil proves transformative change is won when we are united. This was written by Jeremy Corbyn on October 31st, 2022 by The Independent, and was picked up by Common Dreams. So let's go to Clearly here. Those in power can kill 1, 2, or 100 roses, but they'll never be able to stop the arrival of spring, quote unquote. An incredibly moving speech. Lula pledged to end hunger, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and deforestation. On April 7, 2018, Luis Inacio Lula da Silva delivered a speech to thousands of supporters in Sao Paulo. Standing outside the headquarters of the very metal workers union he once led, Lula told the crowd he would one day return. After finishing his speech, Lula turned himself into a nearby police station. The former president and founding member of the left-wing Workers' Party, PT, was following orders of a federal judge who had instructed him to begin serving a 12-year prison sentence for corruption. Describing the conviction as, quote, the biggest judicial lie told in the country's 500-year history, unquote, Lula would spend more than a year in prison, if I recall, 587 days, before the Supreme Federal Court ruled that his imprisonment was unlawful in November of 2019. Lula would not have been freed were it not for a remarkable wave of international solidarity, not least from Lula's legal team, Jeffrey Robertson, KC, and John Watts. Without their work, Lula may still be in prison today. Unfortunately, by the time Lula was released, he had missed and had been barred from running in the 2018 presidential election. I have to say there, just, kind of remark, that previous to the Lula situation, it had been the rule in Brazil that even if people were convicted and in prison, that did not bar them from running. But just to handle Lula's specific case, the legislature acted and changed that rule to bar Lula from running in 2018. The politically motivated conviction, which the UN described as a violation of Lula's right to a fair trial, had paved the way for the victory of the right-wing candidate, Jair Bolsonaro. Sergio Moro, the judge who ordered Lula's arrest would go on to serve as Bolsonaro's justice minister during his 4-year term. With Bolsonaro would unleash a wave of impoverishment, fascism, and ecocide, leading arguably the worst pandemic response in the world. That is one arguably even worse than Donald Trump's. The Bolsonaro block calls for lockdowns, social distancing rules, and also mask mandates, resulting in the second highest death toll across the globe. The pandemic, of course, targeted underlying economic vulnerabilities, but they were vulnerabilities that Bolsonaro's policies drastically exacerbated. At the peak of his war against the poor, 100 million Brazilians were living in poverty. Women, and particularly black women, have paid a disproportionate price for Bolsonaro's social conservatism. It is now harder than ever to access abortion services. LGBT plus people have faced state-sanctioned discrimination too. The self-declared homophobe incited hatred after warning that Brazil was becoming a, quote, gay tourism paradise. Bolsonaro's presidency was a threat to life, both in Brazil and around the world. For every year he was in charge, deforestation of the Amazon rose by at least 75%. By the end of his term, the, quote, lungs of the world, unquote, were and still are at a tipping point where any further deforestation will likely trigger irreversible climate collapse. Bolsonaro's assault on the environment was an assault on indigenous communities too. There was a 180% rise in reported cases of indigenous land invasion between 2018 and 2021. Although Lula was freed in 2019, it wasn't until March 2021 when, following another ruling, he was officially allowed to run for president in 2022. Lula's campaign was reborn. So too then was the campaign to save the Brazilian democracy and the future of our planet. On the ballot was a choice between socialism or extinction. Not everyone agrees with that. At the invitation of Brazil's trade unions, I traveled to Brazil with the Progressive International as part of their established election observation arm. So Bolsonaro repeatedly warned that he would not respect the result of the election if he lost. Our mission was to defend democracy in Brazil in an election vital for the future of our civilization. Election day was agonizingly tense. For those of us on the ground, it soon became clear that Lula was not just up against Bolsonaro, but the machinery of the Brazilian state. We received multiple reports of federal police and federal highway police blocking roads and conducting unwarranted vehicle searches in the poorest areas of Lula's northern strongholds. Once again, those in power proved they were willing and capable of cutting down 1 to 100 roses. However, just as Lula had promised, they could not stop spring from arriving. At around 7:30 p.m. in Brazil, Lula emerged victorious, beating Bolsonaro by a hair's breadth. Relief turned to ecstasy. Those of us waiting for Bolsonaro to address the delegation of international guests embraced each other and sang in celebration. Entering the room to a chorus of joy, Lula spoke at great length to those who had supported him. In an incredibly moving speech, Lula pledged to end hunger, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and deforestation. One line was particularly memorable, quote, "When we cut down an ancient tree, we cut down a part of our own lives. My government will stop the destruction of Amazon entirely. With us, it is safe forever," unquote. By tackling the illegal mining in the north, indigenous communities would no longer be systematically murdered by the greed for gold. Quote again, "No price of gold," unquote, he said, and quote again, "is worth anyone's life," unquote. Lula's tone was hopeful and furious in equal measure. His anger at the level of misery Bolsonaro had inflicted was palpable, lamenting the fact that despite being a major food exporter, Brazil had children starving on the streets of its cities. Lula vowed to repeat and go further than what he did the last time he was president, lift millions out of poverty. Perhaps the most significant part of his speech came at the end. Brazil, he said, would not be dragged into a new Cold War or an endless arms race. A Lula-led Brazil would endeavor to foster good relations with all global partners for the sake of international peace. Last night's results do not just mark a stunning comeback for Lula. They are, I hope, a comeback for our humanity. Responding to chants of "Viva Lula," quote unquote, the new president insisted this was not a victory for him. It was a victory for a, quote, democratic movement that formed above parties, personal interests, and ideologies, unquote. Lula had won with the support of workers, indigenous people, and the marginalized. I saw this firsthand throughout the campaign, spending time with trade unions, a plethora of parties that had coalesced around him, and grassroots movement like the Landless Workers Movement, MST, and the Homeless Workers Movement, MTST. Lula's victory came from a left-led coalition of political parties and social movements. Who needs focus groups when you have solidarity? The global struggle for equality, democracy, and peace goes on. That includes the struggle right here in the UK. I hope that people who are eager to celebrate the victories of those overseas are equally as supportive as those fighting for a radical transfer of wealth, power, and ownership closer to home. Lula's triumph proves that when we are united, transformative change can and will be won. 2 years ago, Lula was in prison serving an unjust conviction. Today, he is the president of Brazil. As Lula told his supporters back in 2018, quote, "There is no point in trying to end my ideas. They are already lingering in the air and you cannot arrest them," unquote. Shared by millions around the world, Lula's ideas no longer linger. They live, they breathe, and they are here to stay. Last night's results do not just mark a stunning comeback for Lula. They are, I hope, a comeback for our humanity. And all I have to say to that one is, um, oh, Jeremy Corbyn. So that was the second piece. Okay, I wanted to read to you and to comment on. It was, of course, a speech of appreciation of Lula and his great victory. It was an optimistic speech and an optimistic post. Let's hope that the promise of this speech is realized during this coming term. But it is far from sure that this will be realized. There was another piece which appeared in the American Prospect. That piece is by Robert Kuttner. It appeared on October 31st, 2022, just yesterday. It is entitled, What Brazil Teaches America, and it was by Robert Kuttner, the former editor of the American Prospect, and now still a writer for the American Prospect, where David Dayen is now the editor-in-chief. So, a supporter of Luis Inácio Lula da Silva celebrates his victory in Brazil's presidential election in downtown Rio de Janeiro, October 30th, 2022. And you see the gentleman there with a Lula button stuck to his forehead. Okay, and a fan with Lula's face on it, with joy on his face and in his eyes. The 2-point victory of Luis Inácio Lula da Silva over neo-fascist incumbent Jair Bolsonaro prompts comparisons with the containment of neo-fascism in the United States, but let's draw the right lessons. One is that Lula had an immense stock of goodwill to draw on from the working people of Brazil because of the stunning program of practical, easy-to-grasp help that he delivered during his 2 terms of office between 2003 and 2010. His program included the famous Bolsa Familia, which gave cash grants to poor families as long as their kids attended school and got vaccinated. It was the world's largest direct cash program, and thanks to the Bolsa, poverty in Brazil under Lula dropped by 27%. Lula also worked closely with Brazil's unions so that gains went to the middle class as well as the poor, and he began reversing deforestation in the Amazon. The Wall Street Journal quotes a lab technician, Germano Silva, recalling how under Lula's presidency he could afford to travel by airplane for the first time instead of taking a long bus ride. He put three children through college thanks to a new government scholarship program enacted under Lula. And he said, quote, "My vote is one of gratitude," unquote. Until Biden managed to get a 1 year universal basic income for parents, and Democrats delivered nothing remotely close to this over the past three Democratic presidencies. They are now having to rebuild credibility with cynical working class voters, starting about 40 points down. Lula, by contrast, delivered the kind of unapologetic help to ordinary Brazilian people that a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren might have delivered. On Sunday, the people reciprocated. The second lesson, sadly, is that Brazil's democratic institutions are better bolstered than ours in the United States. Lula has been certified as the winner in a direct popular vote, and there is no counterpart to the Electoral College or the formal certification by the U.S. House to invite mischief. Even so, Lula does not take office until January the 1st, and there has been conjecture that Bolsonaro will find ways to overturn the election. However, unlike in the U.S. in Bush v. Gore, the courts would oppose that, and the military, which supported coups in the 20th century, as recently as 1964, leading to a brutal 21-year dictatorship, is no fan of Bolsonaro. A New York Times piece in August quoted an interview with Luis Roberto Barroso, the Supreme Court Justice and Brazil's former elections chief, about the last successful coup in Brazil in 1964. The middle class, quote, "the middle class supported it. Business people supported it, and the U.S. supported it. Well, none of these players support a coup now," unquote. Also in August, more than 1 million Brazilians, including former presidents, leading academics, lawyers, and pop stars, signed a letter defending the country's voting systems. Business leaders released a similar letter. Another instructive comparison is the role of corruption in both countries. In the U.S., working class MAGA voters look past Trump's gross corruption because, in the absence of much economic help from Democrats, they are convinced that Trump is on their side culturally. In Brazil, Lula served time for an alleged corruption scandal, a conviction that was eventually overturned. This history didn't bother a majority of the Brazilian voters, who have proof positive that Lula is on your side. One further comparison is the role of economic elites. In Brazil, the business class backed the 1964 coup, and many corporate and financial leaders backed Bolsonaro in 2018 to end the long dominant role of Lula's Brazilian Workers' Party. This time, Bolsonaro's personal instability and failed policies, including Brazil's COVID disaster, gave just enough corporate leaders pause. In the U.S., corporate elites don't much like Trump, but they back Republicans down the line. Democrats have a lot to learn from Lula. Here's a picture of Bob Kuttner. Kuttner, the author of the article. Robert Kuttner is co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect, and he's a professor at Brandeis University's Heller School. So this was published on October 31st at 12 p.m. So that provides some hope that there will not be a coup, because the situation is different from that of the 1964 coup. But there's another reason why there probably won't be a coup, in this case. And that is because in the first round of the elections, there were many people, of Bolsonaro's party who were elected to the Congress. They now hold a majority in the Congress, and the Workers' Party, Lula's party, has only a minority in the Congress. So the likelihood is that the Congress will now create a substantial check on what Lula wants to do. While Lula has been very explicit about his desire to do even more for the poor and middle class and for the Amazon than he did in his first two terms, he did not have the hostile houses of the Congress in those first two terms that he will now have. That calls into question the possibility that he will be able to deliver the kind of help that he once did. If he is able to do it by appealing to the people and by going over the heads of the Congress, then it will be wonderful, because Lula knows how to deliver concrete help that people appreciate. In contrast to what Biden did here. Of course, the American Rescue Plan was good, but of course, we all know that the American Rescue Plan involved a visibly broken promise, namely the $2,000 checks that were promised by Biden were never delivered. Only $1,400 in checks were actually delivered. The excuse of the administration that, well, Biden didn't really promise the $2,000, he promised $1,400 in addition to Trump's $600. No, gentlemen, that's obviously a distortion, because the $600 was already delivered by Trump. Those checks were going out in January, when Biden was down in Georgia in the early part of January, promising the $2,000 checks. It's as plain as day that Biden broke that particular promise. Another promise he broke was the promise to deliver a $15 an hour minimum wage to the American people as part of the American Rescue Plan. He promised that quite explicitly. When he became the president, he worked with people in Congress to pass the ARP without the minimum wage provision in it. He did this because some of his closest supporters in the Senate were against the $15 an hour minimum wage. He also did this by telling people that he respected the parliamentarian And the parliamentarian, who is a paid civil servant of the Congress, the parliamentarian had said that the raise in the minimum wage to $15 an hour was not within the scope of a reconciliation bill. Biden said he respected her. I said at the time, he can respect her all he wants, but he doesn't have to listen to her. Yeah. The history of this is quite explicit. The decision as to what to include in the reconciliation bill remains a decision governed by the politicians. Specifically, all that had to be done was to have kept the $15 an hour minimum wage in that bill. By the way, it's too inadequate anyway. And if it had been kept in that bill, if Biden had told Chuck Schumer to keep it in that bill, then it would have been passed. I know Manchin didn't like it. I know Sinema didn't like it. But that bill never reached the floor. So Manchin and Sinema were not in the position of turning down the whole American Rescue Plan because they didn't like the minimum wage provision. They were never put in that position, nor were the other 6 people who joined them in opposing Bernie Sanders' amendment, which was made necessary by Schumer's cutting $15 an hour out of that bill. There was no need for any of the senators to respect what the parliamentarians said. The parliamentarian doesn't control what goes into those reconciliation bills, and she doesn't control what reconciliation bills will pass. Her role is purely advisory. After making a solemn promise to the American people to pass the $15 an hour minimum wage, Biden simply broke the promise. He put forward some BS, but he broke that promise. He broke a number of other promises that we won't go into here. But the point is that there's a big difference between Lula and Biden. The Wall Street Journal, I went through that, okay, already, so I'm not going to repeat it. So, I will say there's no comparison, okay, of Biden to Lula. Lula has done many courageous things in the presidency. It's hard to find one really courageous thing that Biden has done that was opposed by his donors. So, what is the future for Brazil? It is still uncertain because Lula faces opposition. Let us hope it is not the kind of opposition that Democrats have gotten from Republicans here in the United States. Not just in the Biden administration, but the kind of opposition that Democrats have gotten from the Republican Party since the election of Barack Obama. whatever the Democrats put forward, they opposed to the best of their ability as a solid block of increasingly right-wing legislators. If the same, thanks, honey. If the same thing happens in the Brazilian environment, then Lula's upcoming presidency is unlikely to be a successful presidency. But what Brazil and Lula also teaches America is that the leftist parties can be successful when they deliver good programs to people that fulfill needs and that are easily understood by people. Cash grants to poor families is a fine way to go. The child tax credits that were used by the Biden administration, that was a fine way to go. But there was a problem with it. They made it a temporary program instead of making it a permanent program. Had they made it a permanent program, they could have run on the child tax credit and the American Rescue Plan. And they would be much closer to victory than they are today. So they've blown it because the donors did not want it. The same goes for the minimum wage. They could have passed that as part of the American Rescue Plan. At the time, Manchin and Sinema would not have stood against it because it was recognized by a consensus of the Democratic Party that Biden needed a victory to start off with. Nobody really disagreed on that. From the Democratic Party standpoint, it was a honeymoon period for the president. They were all constrained by the situation to vote for that first bill, whether they liked it or not. Biden could have gotten what he wanted had he proceeded very boldly with it and dared the people in the Democratic Party who had doubts about it, but to oppose him. I think he would have gotten through. Anyway, I will now turn to your comments. Hi, Dolores. I like your new avatar. Looks very good. Steve Wolfbrand said, hung, sorry. He says, I bet, Steve, we need a Lula here. I think we need even more than a Lula here, but we can start with a Lula. Steve Wolfbrand said, I was in Venezuela. The government would drop off pallets of cinder blocks and concrete. I read that before, actually. And Dolores says, hi, Kay. Hi, Steve. Steve talks about a music program in Venezuela, that he was in Cuba. And he says Bolsonaro is terrible for the Amazon. He also said, those school kids in Cuba are so cute. They wear uniforms. The boys wear ties. Facebook user says, hello. Hi, Facebook user. Whoever you are. And U.S. military is now officially on the ground in Ukraine. They are? Officially on the ground in Ukraine? In what role, Brandy? In what role? Steve says, Lula lifted millions out of poverty. Steve says, I saw it with my own eyes. And Joanne Olenhouse Racadio is here. Hello, Joanne. It's been a long time. Joanne waves. Steve Wolbrand says, I saw the trucks in Venezuela as well. Delivering materials to poor people to build a house. I saw it with my own effing eyes. Kay says, nice, Steve. And Steve says, I am so happy for Lula. Kay says, me too, Steve. And Steve says, the Brazilian people are very dear to me. They are very sweet people. My Portuguese got pretty good. Steve says, smash the like button. Steve says he's a very great man. Yes, please smash the share, like, and subscribe buttons if you haven't already subscribed. Steve says, I've never been to Rio. I want to go. And Steve says, the West, congratulations to Lula, will make a coup very difficult for Bolsonaro. Yep. That also is different from 1964. Kay says, I've heard that, Joe. Kay says, exactly, Joe, parliamentarian sucks. You know who really sucks? It was Biden and Harris, okay, and Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and Chuck Schumer and the others who voted against the amendment by Bernie Sanders. Steve asks, where's Lisa? Lisa is taking some time off. She's had a number of serious family problems, including illnesses of members of her family. And she is taking care of those. Okay, I continue to send her the links to the streams so she can join. Okay, if it's possible for her to join. I do think she'll be back at some point, but I don't know when. I am patiently waiting for her. Steve Wolbrand said, yep, trainers in Ukraine. That's another escalation. Another escalation. That's a terrible escalation. There was no need for that. It's another provocation. The problem with Democrats is they're into mongering that war. They are definitely mongering it. It will be better for Ukraine if the United States just gets out of the way. Now, I'm not going to say more about that because that's not what this stream is about right now. Kay says, sorry to hear that about Lisa. Steve Wolfbrand says, bummer, Lisa. We love her. Yeah, we do too, Steve. We do too, Bonnie and I. So it's 10. I think we've come to the end. I'll be back tomorrow with 3 streams. And we'll be covering the elections on Thursday and probably on Friday too. There's still a lot that is going on. We don't know whether the donors, the rich, the independent expenditure organizations, we don't know whether they're going to win, okay, in these upcoming elections. They've started pouring in lots of money again. We will know in a few days if they're being successful with that money. Summer Lee is under attack again, so we know that is happening. Steve Wolfbrand says, okay, good night. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for your help here tonight. And thank you all for your help. Hopefully, I'll see you tomorrow. I'll be streaming in the late morning or the early afternoon tomorrow. And of course, at 9 o'clock in the evening. And I hope to see you. Please note my Patreon account, patreon.com/Joe_Firestone, and my Buy Me a Coffee account, buymeacoffee.com/Joe.Firestone. If you like my work, please visit those two places occasionally. And when you get there, I'm sure you'll know what to do. So thank you very much. Steve says, red tsunami. Steve, the fat lady may sing, but it ain't over until the fat lady sings.
I'm skinny.
Huh?
I'm skinny.
I know. I'm very glad of that. Okay, folks, good night. And we love you too, Kay.